Known for his leadership and exceptional business acumen, my next guest has made significant contributions to India's growth story as one of the pillars of Indian metal and mining industry, along with driving export agenda. Recently elected as President of FICCI, please welcome Mr. Subhrakant Panda, Managing Director of Indian Metals and Ferro Alloys Limited, to this episode of Duologues. So Subhrakant, thank you so much for sparing your time for this episode of Duologues with me. Before we begin the conversation, I would like to congratulate you for taking over as President at FICCI. I'm sure you're filling in large shoes, a huge legacy which FICCI has created, contributing specifically for policy-related conversations for many, many decades. In that sense, it's a large responsibility, and having working closely with you over the last few years, I realized that I'm sure we are going to make a big difference. Specifically in this year, we'll speak about the recent budget which got announced. We'll speak about your life itself. But the first question to begin with is what it takes, how does it feel getting into this position at FICCI?
First of all, Manish, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you on this show of yours, Duologue. I think it's a great opportunity to share my thoughts and views, as you said. Now, to get to the question, it's obviously a great privilege to be heading an organization like FICCI, which has a rich legacy of 95 years and a lot of history in the making, if I can put it that way.
Absolutely.
That apart, I take a great pride in the fact that I'm the first person from the state of Odisha to head this organization. And while it is obviously a national responsibility, the fact that I'm the first from the state is something that gives me a lot of pride, as I said. In terms of what it entails in this role, it's as I said, it's a wonderful opportunity to learn and to contribute, and it's something which forces you to go outside of your comfort zone. Left to myself or anyone for that matter, I mean, you're so caught up in the day-to-day of running your own business that looking beyond the confines of that particular filter is not something that one does very often. But this is a role which sort of forces you out of the comfort zone, makes you look at a variety of areas. As you would know, FICCI has 75-80 committees covering probably every aspect of the economy.
True.
It's the sort of position papers which come to my table, the sort of issues which come up for discussion. It's a wonderful learning opportunity for me. And while I will look to do the best that I can to take the organization forward, leave it in a better place than I found it, which is what I think all leaders look to do. But I have no doubt that I'll get enriched a lot in this 1 year.
True. So Subhrakant, I've seen you, being, say, the chairman of the Odisha Council, to being vice president at FICCI, to senior vice president at FICCI, and now being the president. We'll talk about the qualitative aspects of how your day-to-day life has changed, your priorities at FICCI, and so on and so forth. Has the life changed significantly? And you touched upon an important topic that you're pushing your boundaries. Would this particular subject also be your consideration? Say the way FICCI operates, the structure itself, the skill sets of people, the way the advocacy is being done. Probably analytics is now starting to sit at the center of the conversation. So in that sense, a lot has to change, including the skill sets of people. So how has your life changed? I'm sure, how are you balancing it, your own work and your efforts at FICCI?
So I've been active in FICCI for close to 2 decades. As you said, I was the first chairman of the Odisha State Council. I headed the manufacturing committee at the national level. And of course, there is a 3-year leadership ladder as part of the presidium, as you mentioned.
Right.
So I have been very active in FICCI, and I have a lot of insights into how the organization works. And I would put it in this manner that I think every organization needs to evolve with time. And I believe I have the necessary insight to sort of put in place some of the changes that are necessary for FICCI to be, to move with the times. The way I put it, for example, our tagline is the voice of industry. But what is Indian industry? That itself is changing, right?
True, true.
And we need to adapt with the changing times to remain relevant and to be able to deliver value to all our members and all our stakeholders. In terms of how I manage my time, well, it's first of all, I think a leadership role like this, it all depends how you take it, and I firmly believe that the time you contribute to it is sort of proportionate to the value that one gets out of it, like I said, at a personal level as well. So yes, it's a lot of pressure on time, balancing my own business interests, because that's something that I have a responsibility to stakeholders there as well. And of course, not to mention personal life and time for family. That apart, in terms of priorities, like I mentioned, I think one of the things for FICCI is to evolve with the times and be representative of what Indian industry stands for at the moment. And to do that, I think there is also a lot of internal rejigging which needs to be done.
Right.
So a lot of rejigging of internal committees, overarching committees, so that we take a coherent stand on issues like the environment, as opposed to earlier there were related committees which were set up separately.
Right.
So I think getting that coherence going has been one of my focus areas. As also the fact that to get the committees and the state councils up and running quickly, because it's a one-year term and you don't want to lose time setting those things up.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad that I've been able to do that, and we already have a sort of a broad action plan at the various state councils, the various committees, and not to mention some of the priorities that I intend to pursue as president.
That's a great point you've made, Subhrakant, because this kind of resonates in a very similar manner with organizations. Like our organization has evolved over the last 104 years. And part of this evolution is that in order to give it back to the society or create solutions for the society, you end up creating solutions sometimes in isolation. And then comes a need that how do you create synergies between all these efforts which you have made over the last so many years. So would be the case at FICCI, and nobody can be in a better position than you who have already experienced it, who have experienced this journey coming in from state councils. So you have seen this side from that side, and now you're here. And I would completely agree. While it might not be easy because there might be different committees existing for different purposes, and there might be a situation where these committees have to start to talk to each other, because there are many topics which now start to cut across all these committees, including the state committees also. So I believe that this effort is the need of the hour and in the right direction. So I wish you all the best for this initiative. While one can assume that with so much of opportunity existing within the country, and I believe now our ambition is to go beyond looking at the opportunity within our country. The data points clearly reflect that we are just around the corner for that point of inflection, and then we may continue to sustain that kind of opportunity for next 30-40 years. But the leadership has clearly demonstrated that ambition should go beyond. In that sense, from businesses perspective, not only look at assembling the goods which we consume in the country, but also driving backward integration into component manufacturing, say for our industry, and also then start to enable exports. So in that sense, various committees of FICCI may have large responsibilities, including FICCI's alignment for the purpose of driving the strategy and assisting on that strategy of Atmanirbhar Bharat, working very closely with Scale Committee. A lot of efforts have happened. Sure. It's safe to imagine that your focus would be cutting across almost everything, what happens at FICCI. But are there some top priorities which are coming to your mind when it comes to, say, policy or our contribution specifically to bridge the gap between the industry and the government?
So a couple of things. One overarching sector which is going to get a lot of attention from me, given my background, but more importantly, the relevance for India is manufacturing.
Absolutely.
And again, the data points here are very clear. If you look at the situation currently, Agriculture accounts for about 17-18% of GDP, but close to 50% of jobs.
Yeah.
And that's something certainly which is not tenable going ahead.
Yeah.
And while the service sector has done very well in India and will take up a lot of jobs,
Yeah.
but having said that, it's very, very important for manufacturing, which has been stuck in that 15 to 18% range in terms of share of GDP, for it to move up to 25 odd percent. And in that context, initiatives by the government, such as the PLI scheme for 14 sectors, which are with a 1.97 trillion rupees outlay, creating new jobs, creating large outputs, I think is a very, very important step, and something that we at FICCI are looking to collate suggestions and see how we can take that forward. And in that context, as far as the PLI scheme is concerned, I'm a very big votary, because earlier you used to have subsidies which, as the Prime Minister said, barely kept a sector alive.
Absolutely.
This is not subsidy. This is a sort of an initial booster to attract a catalyst to attract capital investment and lead to the creation of manufacturing champions with global scale. I think that is something which is very important, which is something that India needs, and in the geopolitical context of China +1 comes at absolutely the right time, where India has the opportunity for the second time around to really board the manufacturing bus and take it ahead. And one of the points here is that I think there is scope to expand PLIs to include components, to include certain subsectors of chemicals, etc., electrical components, where there is a lot of potential, which are perhaps import dependent upon at the moment, and which also have the potential to create significant employment opportunities in the country. That apart, what I alluded to a little while ago about my priorities during my term as president. Now, given the presidium concept, there is a lot of continuity in what we do, in what my predecessors have done, what my successors will do. There is a lot of continuity, but I think every president brings his or her own priorities to the table, and in that context, I'm looking at three. One specifically that I'm looking at is a SME project. Where we are in the midst of putting together a survey where we reach out to our vast membership base. And keep in mind that FICCI not just has a vast membership base, but we are a federation because we have associations which are by and large MSME associations as our members. So the idea here is to understand not just the basic issues like the source and access, the access to finance and the source of financing and market access, but more importantly, their awareness of and preparedness for digitalization and sustainability. The working assumption here is that large companies know what to do, and if they don't, then they know where to go and who to ask the right questions to formulate a plan of action. But when we look at the next level and the next level, which are all part of the manufacturing ecosystem, when we talk about issues relating to digitalization and sustainability, it's not enough for only the large companies to be compliant, to be to have that edge, because particularly when it comes to digitalization, I think it can enable Indian companies to leapfrog and attain efficiencies which would not be possible otherwise.
Absolutely.
And sustainability is, of course, very important. I don't need to explain that. And so from that point of view, that's what we're looking to do, to understand the awareness of and preparedness of MSMEs on the twin issues of digitalization and sustainability. That apart, another priority is the Northeast. FICCI has been very active in the Northeast, and we do plenty of events and likewise. But we also do an interesting event called the Connectivity Summit. So in this year's edition, and we're still in the process of working out the details, I want to bring in the concept of the border area economic development in as much as it pertains to connectivity, because the idea of connectivity is to bring prosperity and growth to the region, to any region. And I think that's especially so when it comes to our border areas and when it comes to the Northeast. So that is the second priority. The third thing that I'm looking at is with regard to startups, and that has a dual concept. One is, going back to the point I made, that if FICCI is going to be the voice of Indian industry, then Indian industry itself is changing.
True.
I think we have a vibrant startup ecosystem with more than 77,000 registered startups, 100 plus unicorns. FICCI needs to have plenty of them as part of our ecosystem for there to be mutual benefit. But what I'm specifically looking to do with regard to startups is to ensure that how do we bring about a commingling of our members representing brick and mortar sector with the startups. And this is a two-way street because startups will benefit by way of mentoring. Somebody might want to invest in technologies and certainly market access, etc. But I think in as much as our members are concerned, they too would have access through these startups to disruptive technologies and ideas that they in the normal course of business may not sort of get to.
Right.
So this is a two-way street, and I believe that it's something that will deliver value to our members, deliver value to startups, and overall serve to make FICCI sort of more vibrant, if I can put it that way.
Thoughts which are coming to my mind or reflections hearing you. First one is that your effort is going to drive entrepreneurship across smaller towns of the country, essentially through inclusion. Second is it is going to empower people and possibly people at the border areas with connectivity. So a better empowerment would be the logical first step, and then I'm sure a lot is going to change. And third is, I believe, collaboration. So how can, say, our industry, which is more of a brick and mortar, can start to collaborate and create a higher value for the society. So it's a great effort.
And in fact, when we had an interaction a few months ago when your global chairman was here, you made a very good point about it's not just Panasonic's presence in India, but the ecosystem that you help create. So that collaboration, I think, is very important, and it's a two-way street. It's no one is doing anybody a favor. It's a two-way street where everybody stands to gain.
So some reflections on the recently announced budget. From my point of view, it started with something which no one expected. 33 to 34% increase in the capital expenditure. It was a bold move. When the government is getting into elections, you don't make such announcements because you come up with more populist, announcements. But you started off with a 33% expansion in the capital expenditure. The speech ended with putting money in the hands of people. And in between, from my point of view, you hear 3 center of excellences for artificial intelligence to be in top 3 universities, 100 laboratories for incubating and developing applications into 5G. You hear energy transition, so 35,000 crores being allocated for energy transition. So it's gonna be game changing. And the way I reflected upon after the budget was announced, that this is something like an Ayurvedic treatment. It will take some time to take effect, but the outcomes and the results are going to be everlasting. And these are my reflections. What are your reflections on the recently announced budget?
Well, first of all, I think it is a bold, progressive budget, and something that FICCI had been advocating, that it needs to be a growth-oriented budget. And it is certainly something which delivers and does so emphatically. So our recommendation, our approach had been that the budget needs to be growth oriented, and I think the best way to do that is to have a public infra capex outlay. And you're absolutely right that the outlay for FY23 was at a record 7.5 trillion rupees, which in itself was about 35% higher than the previous year.
True.
So while everyone was asking for an increase, I don't quite think any of us expected that it would be the magical 10 trillion rupee mark, which is a 33% increase, as you said. And in terms of GDP, about 3.3% of GDP. More importantly, if you take in the grant and aid to states, and keep in mind that this year there is a requirement that the grant and aid kept aside for states has to be spent in the particular financial year, right? Then that figure goes up to 13.7 trillion rupees, which is 4.5% of GDP. And then you have the further stimulus measures, which are also life-changing in their own way, which is the PM Awas Yojana and the highest ever allocation to railways at 2.4 trillion rupees. So it's something which which is astounding, which will have a multiplier effect, because capex in itself for every rupee that you spend has an impact of further 3 rupees,
right,
which will spread across myriad sectors of the economy.
Yeah.
So I think that is something which is very, very important. But I'd also like to touch upon another aspect, which is the credibility of the numbers.
Right.
Because there is in fact a refrain that perhaps the budget is conservative in its revenue targets, which I see as a good thing. Because then it gives the government wriggle room for, if there were any unexpected surprises, and you're not maxed out in terms of your revenue expectations, etc. But the credibility also arises from sticking to a fiscal glide path. So the projection that India would achieve the fiscal deficit target of 6.4% for FY23, going down to 5.9% for FY24, and the reiteration of the commitment to go down to below 4.5% by FY26, I think is important, because again, while we emphasized that it has to be growth as front and center, but equally it you cannot and should not do away with being fiscally prudent.
True.
So I think it is that balancing act between prioritizing growth while keeping an eye on inflation and committing to a fiscal glide path, which is what makes this an exceptional budget. I think it'll go a long way to set India on the path of sustained growth. And indeed, going back to our 95th AGM, where the finance minister had come, she made a point that this year's budget would set the template for Amrit Kaal. The idea being that by the time we see 2047, India would be a developed nation, middle income developed nation, and I think budgets like this is what will get us moving in that direction, and I think at a good pace.
That is true. So Subhrakant, we'll come to the organization which you are heading, and IMFA, I understand, is exporting 90% of its production. You understand what it takes to be an exporter. And one of the priorities with the country also is that we should start looking at beyond the consumption to happen in our own country, while there might be a huge opportunity within the country. So my question essentially is that if you look at last few decades gone by, or maybe last 5 or 6 decades gone by, probably Japan became one of the initial exporters for the fact that they created products top into quality, and that differentiated them from the rest. And then say some of our neighbors started to create cost competitive manufacturing, and that potentially became the differentiator. We have a huge domestic consumption potential to leverage, and hence economies of scale in the time to come. Anything coming to your mind, being an exporter yourselves, that cutting across manufacturing, there might not be a single point to fix everything, but what can be that potential differentiator? And we were, like, before coming into this conversation, very briefly speaking that the mindset of people itself, both into individual consumption and into enterprise consumption, is kind of changing. No longer people are looking at that L1, so to say, cost, but people are looking beyond. In fact, total cost of ownership is becoming central to a lot of purchasing decisions which are happening. So any thoughts coming to your mind that how India can improve its competitiveness, and which are those areas? And a related question might be that you're very passionate about the subject of environment, and I quite often hear you speak on that subject. And today ESG based governance models are again becoming central to a lot of organizations' models. So any reflections on how to improve our competitiveness to become exporter and ESG?
Couple of points that I'd like to make here. First of all, I think India is unique in the sense that we have a large unified domestic market which will serve us very well. But having said that, if we are to look at the sort of sustained growth which is necessary to take us towards being a developed nation in the next 25 years, then exports are also critical in that regard. And it's not a question of either or, but I think both have to be pursued vigorously. We just have the added advantage of having a large unified domestic market,
Yeah.
unlike some of the other examples that you cited. From the other point that I wanted to make is whether it is exports or in fact whether you look at the domestic market, there are certain, the value proposition needs to be there. And I think gone are the days where the export market was treated as a premium market, and you could afford to treat the domestic consumer shabbily.
Right.
I think that phase is passé, unfortunately. And in order to deliver value proposition, I think something that the government has done quite well is the focus on ease of doing business.
Right.
In fact, right through I believe they followed that old saying that never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
And FICCI interacted at various levels with the government, and many suggestions that we gave has found its way into policy. So whether it is reducing the number of compliance touch points, whether it is doing away with outdated rules and regulations, whether it is the national single window, because most states today have their respective single windows for permissions relating to state level issues. But the national single window, I believe, is something which will add a lot of value.
Absolutely.
And going back to a point I made earlier about digitization, I think it's something that is a game changer for India. The example we talk about most often is, of course, UPI, which
Right.
has, but the numbers are unbelievable, and I get wary about quoting any of the data.
Absolutely.
Because the rate at which it's growing,
Yeah.
something data of a couple of months ago is outdated by the time
Yes.
you refer to it.
Right.
So it is where it is, but UPI is a stunning success. But I think there are more such areas which can benefit from, and sectors which can benefit from digitalization, and in easing the way for companies to be compliant and file their documentation. So the entity DigiLocker, for example, there are many examples, but what the FM referred to in her budget speech about entity DigiLocker, I think is something which will be a game changer.
Right.
The second thing is, I think the efforts being made to lower the cost of doing business. So the national logistics policy, the PM Gati Shakti plan,
Absolutely.
these are all very, very well thought out moves, and the advantage of that whole of government approach, and indeed if you plug it back into the point about record outlay for public infra capex
Right.
in this budget, is that this is something which not just provides a stimulus to the economy while it's being implemented, it not just creates jobs while it is being implemented, but when complete, it brings about tremendous savings in terms of the cost of doing business, as well as enhancing the ease of living in this country. I mean, I was on a show a few days ago, and this point came up. If you look at some of the public infra in our country now, I think we are world class.
Right.
And compare that to the crumbling infrastructure in some of the developed countries, and we are actually in a very, very good space.
Yeah.
And what you see today in terms of the revamped railway stations, the new Vande Bharat trains, etc. These are all. I mean, we really ought to be proud about where we are and the direction we are heading in.
Subhrakant, moving on to your own organization, IMFA, it's one of the leading organizations in the space of ferroalloys, with captive mining and, a lot of backward integration, so to say. Give us the reflection. I believe the company came into existence, your parents founded in 1961, if I'm correct.
That's
and
right.
How has the journey been, and how does this space look like? It's a very different space of what I have experienced myself. So give us some reflections on that.
So my father was a research scientist in the US, working on space tech, etc. Then he worked an assignment with the British government, which is where he met my mother in London, and they got married. My mother, of course, is also from Odisha, and they both decided to come back to their homeland and see what they could do to contribute to the progress of industrialization in the state of Odisha, which was rich in minerals, but most of those minerals used to get moved out of, if not the country, then definitely the state.
Right.
So starting out with silicon alloys, we pioneered the production of silicon metal in India, and now we are the leading producer of ferrochrome, which imparts the non-corrosive property to stainless steel. And as you mentioned, we have a fully integrated business model, which means that we do captive mining and captive power generation, which is important because, I mean, when you are in the commodity space, I think having the scale and backward integration to achieve competitiveness is very, very important. So we have grown in size over the years, and at the moment we are embarking upon a expansion plan. I have been very fortunate to be, to grow up in an environment, listen to my father, my parents talk about the business, and it's sort of in my blood, if I can put it that way. But more than anything else, it's something that I'm passionate about, because I think it's very important to enjoy what you do, because taking up a role out of a sense of responsibility, but without actually being enthused by it is I don't think there can be anything worse than that. Absolutely. But this is something that I'm passionate about, and I think the work that we have done to sort of to emphasize the importance of value addition, and doing so at a time when the term value addition was not that much in vogue,
right.
I think is important. And not to mention something that I take a lot of pride in as well, that right from the beginning, our approach has been to live in harmony with the locality around us. So, I mean, most of our facilities are in remote areas in Odisha. So the facilities we set up for our own employees is also opened up to the general public. So be it basic healthcare facilities, be it schools, etc. I mean, we have created that not just for our employees but for the local community as well, because we have always accorded, as I said, importance to living in harmony with the community around us. Our employment is by and large local. Again, 90+% are employees are from the local communities, and that is what I think works well for us.
Absolutely.
And as I say, in all of this, before the term CSR or the mandatory CSR spend came into play, and I take great pride in the fact that we spend far more, nearly 3 to 4 times more than the mandatory minimums on CSR spends. And I think that's something that we believe in significantly, which is giving back to society, and while we grow the business.
The founder of Panasonic, Konosuke Matsushita, was an industrialist, of course, but his philosophies and the basic business philosophy itself, which he created almost 60-70 years before, is pretty much in line with what you mentioned. His thorough belief was that any organization is nothing but a sum total of the resources which are untrusted by the society, by the communities, and therefore the fundamental responsibility of any organization is to ensure that it consistently gives back in equal proportion. And we have 7 principles existing for last 70-80 years, and the first one is actually contribution to society. While engaging at FICCI with various stakeholders, including industry, various committee, people who are leading committees, that is the case with me, is potentially a source of learning for me, and I consistently keep myself updated like that. How have you been doing that? Like, how do you update yourselves? I understand that you read a lot. So what is your source of consistently staying with the times and updating yourselves with the relevant information, while sometimes social platforms can be very cluttering, information may not necessarily be as structured or as channelized as you wish to be consuming yourselves. So how do you update yourselves periodically?
So, you're right, social media sort of get the news quickly, and also certain niche handles in terms of access to certain bits of information. Right. But from that point of view, I'm a traditionalist in terms of newspapers, in terms of a few magazines, etc. So I like reading. I read a lot, but that has sort of gone up a few fold in this role.
Okay.
Because it's important to be abreast of what's going on around you. That is number one. But I must also give credit to the high quality position papers that the FICCI Secretariat comes up with on various aspects, whether it is to do with the economy, the budget, various sectoral papers. I think that is a great source of information as well. And as I said, just to sort of bring in an answer to a question you asked earlier, what I like about this role, and I'm passionate, and I think that helps bring about the passion, is that the exposure to sectors and subjects which are beyond my core competence is what I think I look forward to.
Absolutely.
It's, I mean, obviously there is a greater degree of comfort if I were to talk to you about what is my core competence.
Yeah, true.
And by no means at the end of the year do I expect to be an expert when it comes to electronics or agriculture or something else. But just that little exposure to various sectors is I think what helps open up the open up the mind to different possibilities.
True.
And it's something that you see in one area that sparks an idea which can be relevant for your own field or a particular issue that you're grappling with. So that's what I look forward to.
And not an easy one to deal with. So, Subhrakant, while our conversation was happening, what I understood, and this is one question which I ask everyone on this platform, what I understand is that the very purpose, especially cutting across this year for you, would be a lot to do with what happens at FICCI and even otherwise at IMFA also. So, you might be dealing with variety of purposes at this point of time. However, what is that higher purpose which kind of wakes you up every morning to do what you do?
I think it is to make a difference. It's to make a difference to people's lives. It is to, like I said, when you're dealing with different issues, when you're dealing with various events that FICCI does, and you have a broad spectrum available to you to decide how deep you get into each area. So I think it is that to contribute as much as I can, because I think the more I contribute, the more I stand to gain personally from this from this year. That is one aspect. And if I'm able to make a difference to the people I interact with, to the members that I who raise issues in our interactions, and the beauty of FICCI is that we have we are in a position to interact with various stakeholders, get suggestions on board, provide that as a collate that and provide that to policymakers as a sort of inputs that can be utilized. So that ability to make a difference to those I interact with is what really motivates me.
Inspiring it is, Subhrakant, and I wish you all the best for your leadership at FICCI. And on behalf of all the committees I lead, I will provide my full assistance for this effort which you're trying to make here at FICCI, specifically during this year and beyond. Once again, many thanks for this conversation. I'm sure it is going to be insightful and inspiring to a lot of people who are going to watch this video. Sincerely appreciate your time today.
Thank you.